Dear student, today we will discuss Darwinism, the most famous theory on the evolution of life. And in part 2, Darwinism will be discussing about the application of Darwinism in current scenario. So let's talk about the Darwinism. The theory on the mechanism of evolution proposed by Charles Darwin is called Darwinism, and this theory is famously known as theory of origin of species by natural selection. Alfred Russel Wallace also concluded the evolution through natural selection independently, and 30th June 1858 the theory of natural selection was announced jointly by both, that is by the Darwin and Wallace both. um, so the theory of natural selection states that all the life on the earth is connected and related with each other. The diversity of life is a product of modification of population by natural selection, where some traits are favored. Darwin defined evolution as descent with modification. Darwin's theory explains and describes how organisms on Earth have changed over a period of time and acquired a diversity of new forms. So the famous books that were written by Darwinism on evolution were Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, Voyage of Beagle, and The Descent of Man. Darwin's voyage, let's talk about this because this is one of the important in the life history of Darwin. At the age of 22, he went on 5 year navigation, that is from 1831 to 1836, mapping expedition voyage by aboarding HMS Beagle. So, Beagle was his ship, and he visited the coast of South America. He visited the coast of South America, Australia, Southeast Asia, southern tip of Africa, number of islands, and then he collected the data on their flora and fauna and made careful observations about the similarities and also the differences between them. So on the trip, he realized, in spite of all the species reproducing offspring, in spite of all species reproducing offspring in high number, but their adult form do not dominate, concluding that not all the individual produced in the generation survive. So reproduction rate is high, but all these species are all the individual of that particular species are not surviving, because he observed that number of adults are less as compared to the number of the offspring that get produced. He also observed that individuals of the same kind differ from one another and concluded that the individual with the most favorable variation could have the best chances of surviving to create the next generation. The key points were all the living organisms reproduce to perpetuate their race on earth. They produce offspring in abundance that then those survive. For example, codfish produces millions of eggs per year, and all the eggs develop into the fish. The whole Atlantic, if all the eggs were developed into the fish, the whole Atlantic Ocean will full of cod fish in 5 years. So therefore all the offspring do not survive. It is because carrying capacity of the earth do not support the survival, and there is limited space and food available. The organism compete within the same species, that is intraspecies, and between the member of different species, that is interspecies, and with the environment. So there is competition between the organisms, there is competition with the environment. So this is for what? This is for the resources that are available in the environment. So there is continuous struggle for existence that exists for the survival. The offspring produced are not identical with the parent and not even identical to the siblings. Although look similar, this difference is called variation. The variation could be useful, harmful, or neutral. The useful variation are selected in the next generation. Nature select the best. The best useful variation are selected, and such individuals show best adaptation with the environment, whereas the unfit individual are left out by the selection. For example, the animal only with a fur can survive in tundra regions. The next point is the next generation of favorably adapted species are capable of transmitting their useful variation to their offspring. Next is generation after generation. If the variation keep accumulating, the organism become markedly different, forming new species. So these are the points, key points of Darwinism. Now let's understand what Darwinism mean by survival of fittest. Means ability to survive and then after surviving to reproduce. Okay, so that is what is in terms of survival of species. Variation is pre-existing difference among the member of the same species. So now let's understand what is natural selection. So natural selection is the process by which the organism better adapted to the environment. Okay, so every organism exhibit variation with parent, sibling, and organism within the same species. So variation is there, okay, of a particular trait. The variation is of a particular trait. Okay, and if you see, the natural selection over here is viewed as a pressure naturally occurring on all the organism by nature, and this pressure favors the selection of certain variation. So there exists the variation in the species. Okay, now what will happen when the selection pressure or the nature pressure act on this organism, on a particular species? What will happen? The useful or advantageous variations are selected. Okay, so these variations are referred as trait, and this is called as organism adaptation. So when the particular variation is selected, we say it is the adaptation with the nature. Now the variation which are selected are inherited to the subsequent generations, as the variation are strongly influenced by the environment. Okay, so the one who survive are the one who got adapted betterly with the changing environment, and they pass this trait to the next generation. During the lifetime, the organism is subjected to struggle of existence. Means what? This is necessary. Each and every organism is facing the struggle for existence, and you can say this is a compulsory event, necessity of life. Okay, because everybody has to survive for the food, space, resources, and mate. Okay, so they struggle for existence, for resources and mate, especially in case of animals. And the one which survive under the competition is able to reproduce is considered as fittest. Now if you see, the fittest is not the strength, but it's the ability of organism to reproduce. Now who will survive? The one which do not survive is extinct. The one which survive is the fit, and the one which do not survive is the extinct from the nature. So once the fittest survive over many generation, many useful variation get accumulated, and in this is responsible for evolution of organism. Okay, so one generation quantitatively differ with the next generation. So as a whole result from the differential rate of reproduction. So evolution is because of the differential rate of reproduction and survival. Okay, so in short we can say the natural selection um, is a pressure which is operated on the organism, and the organism already exhibit variation. Okay, so out of that, when this natural selection is operating, the useful variation are selected, and the non-useful variations are not selected. Okay, and these useful variations are selected, but when they are selected, a organism has to face competition with another organism, competition with the nature. So they are struggling for their existence, and the one which survive is called fittest because that organism have adapted the changing traits, plus is able to reproduce or is able to pass on those traits to the next generation. So over a generation, some small variation get accumulated, and this is what is responsible for the evolution of organism, or we can say organism changes to the existing organism changes to new species. So this is what is the explanation for the theory of natural selection, that how the natural selection is operated. So here to sum up, Darwinism described the evolution of new species from the existing one on the earth by means of selective variation, differential reproduction, and survival. Now, what is differential reproduction? The individual with certain variant of trait tend to survive and reproduce more than the individual with other less successful variant. Okay, so the one which survives because of the changing environment, and their rate of reproduction is more than the other one which have not adapted in the nature. Okay, now they may extend, they may survive, but slowly their number get eliminated. During the evolution, the organism undergoes change via successive generation and diversified into many forms. So this is also one of the concept which is called adaptive radiation. We'll be discussing later on. Now, examples of natural selection. One of the very famous example is Darwin's finches. So Darwin observed that um, when the Darwin visited Galapagos Island, he could see 13 different species of finches and identified in different environment. He also observed that nearest South American coast landmass, which is 600 mile away from the Galapagos Island, has only one species of finches. So the finches vary in size, shape of beak. Beak adapted for eating large seed, small seed, fruit, insects. So they were adapted to different foods. Now, what is the explanation? The finches of mainland was original population, single population, or we can say ancestor population. When they settled down on island, okay, the selection pressure operate on that, and they adapted according to the local food available in terms in different region of the island. Okay, the beak modified in subsequent generation. So the variation that gets selected, the traits were selected, was the beak modified in the subsequent generation, and you can say selection of the most favorable variation occur, that is the change in the shape of beak. So now what is a struggle for existence? The less adapted finches, okay, they extinct, okay, or they were having less reproductive rate, they could not survive, whereas the better adapted survived, and they produce at the high they produce at their reproduction was at the high rate, and they increase their population. So this is called differential reproduction and survival. Over many generations, the finches on the island would form a distinct species. So this is reproductive success with distinct beak size, shape, as they were fittest suited to that environment. So this describes the survival of fittest. 13 species of finches with diversity in beak evolved from a single population. This is called divergence. So from one to many finches, many species of finches today, and Darwin suggested that a diverse life form would rise from a common ancestor. Okay, so if you see the Darwin finches, and there was whole lot of later on study which were done and on the Darwin finches. We'll discuss that also. So first let's discuss that further study on Darwin finches. So the Galapagos Islands are the chain of 14 islands in the Pacific Ocean near to equator. They are situated at the west coast of South America. Once upon a time, Galapagos Island was connected to South America coast, so they had similar flora and fauna. But when the island got separated, the flora and fauna on the island evolved independently. The present flora and fauna on each island are much different from those of the mainland and also from the other land. Darwin finches that occupy different islands were different from each other. There exists the homology in the beak because the origin is same, but the beaks are adapted to different function. Organisms of the same group or closely related group, when occupy different habitat, they assume different appearance and their homologous structure. They exhibit great divergence in the form and function. This is called adaptive radiation. Now here you can see insisted on the mainland, then they get diverged. Their beaks get diverged into plant, insect, seed, cactus, and then further divergence is there. For example, the insect, medium insect, insectivorous tree finch, small insectivorous tree finch, large insectivorous tree. So again, they occupy different ecological niche. Okay, so that their chances of survival is more. Okay, otherwise they would have competed with each other. Okay, so the process of the natural selection leads to the establishment of new niches resulting in the speciation. So this is there are certain recent finding also on these that the diversity also leads to the establishment of new ecological niche. Okay, so here again you can see the divergence from one to many, and different beaks are there which are adapted to a different thing. The increase in the diversity also causes the increase in the heterozygous genotype within a species. Okay, so here we'll just uh, pause, and then in the next video we'll be discussing rest of the Darwinism. Thank you.